And we are live. Okay. Let me see. This is not. All right. So we're about to. In fact, I'll put this over here. The next hearing is about to start. Um, to the next day in the testimony regarding the January 6th hearing is about to start. So I'm going to be providing that. Bill Stepien, Trump was supposed to testify, but he has chosen. Well, he is saying that due to a family emergency, he will be unable to testify. He's Trump's former campaign manager. I'm not sure what he was going to say, but I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they have some kind of videotaped, you know, statements from him anyway. Well, yeah, of course they're gonna have some videotaped statements from him, but he was supposed to scheduled to testify, and he's not. And one of the things I figure is if you see how after Thursday they played a footage of Ivanka saying something, and Trump started going off. Like Trump going off on Ivanka lets you know that just how if you cross him, he just loses it. Then you're his enemy. Then you're the worst person in the world. But that's just one of the reasons, you know. Um, that's just something that's evident about Trump. Trump is not about truth. It's not about character. It's not about principle. It's about Trump. Always. It's always been. That's the way he operates. If you if you're kissing his butt, great, awesome. You're his best friend. If you criticize him at all, you're his enemy. You're dead to him. You know you're a fake Republic. You're fake whatever. In this case, you're a fake Republican. If you criticize him, and so yeah, he had criticisms for Ivanka. So I'm pretty sure Bill Stepien was like, okay, let me not testify at the hearing because I don't want to be on Trump's bad side. So let me see if they are up and ready to go with this hearing. It should be starting right about now. Okay, so I'm looking for it. It should be starting. Okay, 10:20. Okay, so they pushed it back because yeah, it was supposed to start at 10, but we have that means we have like 20 minutes left, 20 minutes before it starts, which is cool. Um, so in fact, let me take a look at what's actually on the menu for today, because if we're gonna have a hearing today, then the question is what's happening today? What are they talking about? Uh, so as I said, we already know Bill Stepien is not going to be showing up, and like my theory is he doesn't want to piss Trump off, so he's like, okay, I'm not going to testify because if I testify, Trump is going to get mad at me if I say the wrong thing, and he's clearly they have him there to say something which they feel is going to be beneficial for them and look bad on Trump. So yeah, so that's got to be the reason why he's choosing not to testify today. And I'm like, this is actually the time that I was because with the six committee hearings. the so yeah, he says he has a family emergency, and yeah, as expected, they have because he was supposed. So they've done deposition. They've asked him questions already during the deposition, so they have clips ready in case he wasn't available to testify live. They said so. The focus of today is about Trump lying about the election. Then yeah, they're talking about how he said that he had won the election like right after, even though the numbers didn't indicate that. But now, so remember what happened. The that day ends, that night comes, polls close, and the numbers are coming in, tallies are starting to come in, and now it's not sure what's happening. It's not sure who's winning because Trump is doing very well, and as some certain states are coming in, people are like, "Oh no, Trump could actually win this again," and that's what it's looking like. And I'm like, okay, but but, and Democrats knew this, and there were people that even prior to the close of polls, in fact, prior to election day, there are people who clearly established, okay, listen, a bunch of mail-in voting has happened, so the mail-in votes are going to be the last thing counted. The first things counted are going to be the what's happening at the polls during election day. So those are the results that are going to be coming in initially. Then they said, okay, so then what's going to take time is to tally up all of the mail-in votes because Trump was telling Republicans and conservatives, he's telling people his base not to trust the mail-in ballots. They were like, okay, no, we're going in person. We're gonna be there. So everyone knew going in that the majority of mail-in ballots, and plus because the Democrats were really pushing that, oh no, you don't even have to go, which is, and I really think that that's definitely the reason why the numbers were so high. Like, what are the reasons? So why would the numbers, the voting totals have been so high, other than they basically says, like, here we'll come to your door so that you can vote and you don't even need to leave your house. Because in most elections, people just like, you know what? Is it even worth me getting up out of my chair, out of my comfortable living room, whatever, going outside, whatever the weather's like that day, standing on a long line, dealing with the hassle when I don't actually believe anything's gonna get changed, anything's gonna happen? Welcome, Rocket Man, Rocky Matrix. How you doing? So a lot of people just wind up not going. They just don't feel it's worth even getting up and going to the polls. And I get it. But in 2020, Democrats basically bought the polls to everybody else, especially to their base. So they basically said, "Hey, if we have to worry about people not being motivated enough to leave their house, let's bring the polls to them." So they sent out the mail-in ballots, and I think I'm not really a fan of that. I'm not really a fan of that. The the entire reason of why you have the polls, it does seem to be to leave room for shenanigans. But they knew that Democrats, the mail in ballots were going to be heavily Democratic. So when the numbers were as close as they were, people were like, okay, it looked like the Democrats should be able to win this. and Trump knew as well, which is why November at the end of that Tuesday, Wednesday, he's like, okay, yeah, it's over. Yeah, I won. See, look at the numbers. Unless they're going to try to do something shady, and so Trump knew that the majority of the mail-in ballots were going to be against him, and so he started, he was poisoning the well even before then. Putting out the message, well, if I lose, means the election was stolen. But once the more numbers started coming in, then we get some days left, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday morning. I remember Saturday morning getting ready because I worked that afternoon to evening. So Saturday morning, I'm just taking care of some stuff. Then I get ready to go to work. I go to work. As I'm getting to work, I get by Central Park, and there are people on the people in the streets cheering, and I'm like, okay, I guess the results are finished. I guess they declared the winner now. Pull out my phone, and sure enough, they've declared the winner. And I'm in New York City, so people are dancing in the streets. Uh, People are honking horns. People are like by Central Park, just waving signs and yay, we did it. And I'm like, let me tell you, I wasn't rooting for any of them. Correction, I wasn't rooting for either of them. But I was definitely not going to be celebrating the election of the architect of mass incarceration. That really irritated me because I know men right now that if this guy got, yeah, dancing in the street, yes. Listen, if you remember, like there's several people that will put out like tweets and stuff on social media whenever Biden does something stupid, or like especially when Biden does something regarding the black community, like just slaps us in the face, where people will start playing the footage of people doing the electric slide. I forgot where it was. It might have been in Harlem, but there's a bunch of places where they were doing it. But they were out there doing the electric slide because Biden got elected, and I'm like, I don't know why. Like, we definitely have no reason to celebrate. I'm like, if y'all haven't paid attention to who Joseph Biden is, and we've had decades to see who he is, but people bought into the narrative, they ran with it, and they were like, yes, we beat Trump. And I was like, yeah, Trump was a moron, but now we have another set of problems. And yeah, so like with when once that came through, prefer him over Biden. Okay. So let me tell you what I like. I said I wasn't rooting for either of them. I did like that he had gotten rid of the personal mandate for the yeah, I voted for Joe. I voted for Joe too. Yeah, she like her messaging. So I've seen her do interviews, and yeah, she definitely needs a lot more. She definitely needed a lot more media training and like ability to really. But I would like had she won that, then I might have been like, not just because of her, but because both of those two were gone. Then I would have been dancing in the street. I would have been like, like yeah, like um, yeah, because yeah, if both of them were out, that would have been, and it was just for the sheer the miraculousness of it, of not having a Democrat or a Republican office would be amazing. But yeah, I mean, so it was, he knew what he was doing, and like basically he set the stage for, okay, I gotta tell my base that I didn't lose, the election was stolen from me. And so a lot of that with him is ego. A lot of that with him, with Trump is ego, and him not wanting to admit that he lost. But listen, for real, I got to say this: Trump almost won, despite the fact, despite the horror show that was 2020. He almost won. Now, if he was a rational individual, he would be able to take solace in that. Be like, listen, after the year we just had, the fact that I almost won is a testament to my ability to MC, basically master ceremonies, master a crowd. That's basically like. But with him, he can't acknowledge any shortcomings, any failings. So he had to, like, it had to be like, oh, I won, I'm the greatest, and it was stolen from me, despite the fact that, hey, what beat Trump? Not even, it wasn't even Biden that beat Trump. It was COVID. COVID beat Trump. Being the president of the United States during the disaster that was, that, like, you almost had to lose. The fact that he almost won despite being the president in office when COVID hits, and just does just so much damage to the country, to the world, of course, as well, but to the country specifically in terms of the election. Once that happens, you got to realize that, wow, I almost pulled that off. Okay, so there's some Trump policies. Well, listen, I hate, if there's somebody who's going to cut taxes. Okay, that's definitely better than somebody who's going to raise taxes. And Biden was promising to raise taxes, and he is, and so the inflation that's happening now isn't just Biden. The inflation that's happening now is also happened under Trump with the printing of the money, because they printed, what they did during 2020 was they printed so much, and they knew what they were doing. It was an absolute, it was a theft. It was like the greatest theft, like I we've seen in modern day history, of is what they did to the American people in 2020. And they did it on the guise of helping us, hey, this is for you. But most of the money went to their buddies, and that's just like the legislative packages. When you look at just the money that they printed and then just gave out to special, it's absurd how, yeah, I mean, it was obvious how much damage was going to be done, and we're feeling it now, and we're going to keep feeling it, because there's no plan to stop spending as much money as they are, to stop just engaging in horrible policies. There's no plan to stop it. So yeah, things are going to get worse. Things are going to keep getting bad, but they're going to say that the only thing to do is for us to give them more power, more control, and more of our money. Trump adopted Gary Johnson and Jill Stein's stance with the uh, DPRK, reaching out to Kim Jong Un for peace talks. Yeah, uh, yeah. I mean, foreign policy, I think, is definitely something. Try to be like, there's clearly, we have to lessen the hold that the military industrial complex has over foreign policy. That's got to stop. That's definitely got to stop. because it's not doing the country any favors. It's not doing the people any favors. It's not. It's yeah. It's just not good for any of us if they get what they want. Because if they get what they want, then that means you're gonna have a lot of young men and women, a lot of young Americans getting sent home in body bags, um, coming home with injuries, physical scars, mental scars, all kinds of trauma. And overseas, you're going to have countries that are just decimated, destroyed, um, in shambles because of what we're doing in their countries. And then we have enemies. Foreign aid needs to be cut off. I mean, yeah, with as much debt as the United States has, at some point we have to say, wait a minute, do we really have the ability to be taking care of other countries? And the fact that this money is being stolen from American people, American taxpayers. Let's stop it. At some point, let's stop robbing the American people blind and start fixing up, you know, the country so that we're not continually dealing with these problems. Okay, so let me do. So I think it's ready to start. I'm ready pulling it up. And
At Optimum Business, little by little, we're making
okay, so yeah,
like an improved network that never slows you down. To watch as attendees, witnesses, and committee members arrive. Live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Here we go. Okay, so they're in the room. Doesn't look like they're okay. So the reporters are in the room. They haven't. The actual committee hasn't entered yet. I am gonna try to find out. Yeah, I thought this was starting at 10 o'clock. So it might not even be starting to. Let me see if it starts at 10:30. 10:45. They keep pushing the time back. This is starting to. Okay, so we have time. But yeah, let's take a look at what the schedule is for today. Like I said, what's likely going to happen is they're going to have, since Bill Stepien is not testifying in person, they're most likely going to be going ahead with the, yeah, they're most likely going to be going ahead with deposition testimony. So he did film and record some deposition testimony. So they're probably going to just be playing clips of his prior deposition testimony in place of him actually coming to testify in front of the committee. And so now the interesting thing is, so they're going to have two witness panels, and they're focusing on Trump's false claims about him winning the election. Like, I wonder if anybody who's been charged and who hasn't pled guilty yet, if they're going to, if they're like relying on information from this, because they should absolutely be getting information, any information that's publicly available, and even the stuff that's not publicly available, they should be trying to get copies of and put subpoenas in for this information, in that it relates to a defense, like I said, a public authority defense, where they can say, listen, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, said, go do this. That's what we did not know we were doing anything illegal. We thought we had the blessing of the president. Not no, do we think we had? He said, go to the Capitol, go make sure everything is because the case he set out was not only that the election had been stolen, but that the protesters, January 6th protesters, needed to go to make sure that the process was followed as it was supposed to be followed, to make sure that they're to basically be there as observers, to let the politicians know, hey, we see you, we know we're not going to let you do anything illegal. Like every person that was, well, not everybody, because like I said, there were some people that did some extra stuff. They did some real extra stuff when they got to the Capitol. The people that were, like spreading fecal matter around like that, that's some disgusting stuff. Yeah, you can't say you're gonna have a much harder time saying, well, yeah, Trump told me to do that. Like when did Trump tell you to do that? No, that's something you did on your own. And so you may be able to get away with the being present at the event, the trespassing. Hey, I didn't know I was trespassing. If you weren't one of the people that actually broke the windows go in, I was like listen, some people were let in. These are all things that it would have been great to see people use that stuff in the defenses. And because Trump set them up. He really did. He set his people up and then turned his back on them the next day. That was some sucker nonsense. Like if you're gonna send your people, stand by your people. Like don't like that's just a sign of a weak leader, a weak, spineless leader that will send his people into war and then just oh no, I didn't have anything to do. I don't know why they did that. Like, you coward. You absolute coward. Ah. Like, that's one of the things, like, I look at Zelensky. Like, they were like, because remember Zelensky. They said, Zelensky, we're coming. We can get you out. The Russia's about to attack. Russia's starting. We'll get you out. Zelensky says, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying. I'm staying. I'm fighting. Like, I'm telling my people to stay and fight. I'm not going to bounce. If I'm telling my people to stay and fight, I'm staying and fight. And I'm like, you know what? And just look how much harder his people have fought for him. Because that's what a leader does. That's what a leader does. You don't just sell your people out at the first sign of difficulty. Management throwing you under the bus is nothing new. It's not. It's not nothing new. But when that happens, that's when you know management is some garbage, and they could go. They could they could kick rocks. You know. Listen, he's not a coward though. I don't know if I know he's not a coward, and so his people fight for him because he's willing to stand there and say, "Listen, I'm not going nowhere. I'm not going to just like I'm gonna be here. I want my people to be here. I'm gonna stand here and fight. And that's what and his people know that okay, we're ready to fight and put our lives on the line because he's not just gonna run and hide at the first sign of trouble. So we got opposing political parties. Okay, I'm like I said, I'm not arguing anything else other than his him being a leader that didn't turn tail and run. That's a fact. But that's why it makes no sense. People still riding for Trump talking about, oh yeah, he should be president. Well, it doesn't matter. Like he's not willing to actually take like he'll say stuff on social media, but as soon as like they come up to him and say, listen, oh no, well I'm not the I lost the election, but when they're not there, then he'll get on social media again and start typing on True Social. Well, yeah, I just said that because they wanted me to, but I really won the election. Yeah. So in other words, Trump, you're admitting you're a coward. Um, but yeah, it's going to be. Oh yeah, so yeah, there's another thing I want to point out. So because I saw somebody talking about this, and they're like, it's one sided, it's lopsided, it's not like this is not. And I think people cannot be looking at this as in terms of a trial. So this is not Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard. This is not because you're not getting two sides of this.
County House Office Building, waiting for the second January 6th Select Committee hearing to begin. Among the witnesses today, former Fox News political editor Chris Stirewalt.
So you're not getting unedited news. Well, you're not getting both sides of the story. You're getting a very carefully curated narrative. That means this is more like so. This is less like this is not a trial. This is more like a grand jury hearing. So if you're thinking in terms of if you're thinking of this in terms of it being a grand jury hearing, what you're basically seeing is the prosecution side of the case. And so, yeah, they will put evidence in front of you that puts Trump in the paints Trump in the worst possible light, because that's what this is. This is just like a grand jury hearing. That's what the grand jury is convening, and they're trying to say this is the evidence against him. It's not a trial where you're actually going to be able to see, you know, pro Trump side provide exculpatory evidence that indicates that this went somehow differently than the narrative is. But that's why when people are watching this and thinking, oh, he should be convicted and held accountable, but they're just putting on their narrative. That's it. This is their narrative. This is their version, and there's enough facts to allow them to tell this story. There may be exculpatory evidence, but it's not there because they have an agenda. This is the picture they're painting. This is the story they're telling. They're not required to put the stuff that undermines their narrative forward. They get to choose to tell the story. And this is what they're doing. This is the story they're telling. They're telling a story of how blatantly corrupt Trump is. And hey, let's face it, Trump helped them tell this story very well because Trump does a lot of dumb stuff. So what time is it now? Okay, well it's still plenty of time. But people are actually now sitting down in the chamber. Now, is there anyone here who thinks that the election? Okay, yeah. So yeah, let me ask that. Was the election stolen from Trump? One, four, two. So yeah, so feel free to type in the chat if you think if the election was stolen from Trump. One for yes, two for no. Feel free to type that in the chat. See, the simple fact is, I saw problems with the election way before November. I think was that November 7th. Way before November 7th or 6th, whatever day that was. Um, yeah, it is. But way before November, there were problems with the election. Like, do y'all remember? Does anybody remember the Iowa caucuses? Like the nonsense that went on in Iowa, where Bernie Sanders should have walked away with that clearly. But then there was all kinds of shenanigans that happened. There were people like Deval Patrick, I think. Yeah, Deval Patrick actually got numbers in that, and people were like, "What? That's impossible." And so they would. What happened in Iowa was just the tip of the iceberg. But to let you know from the jump, this joint is they're willing to go all out to make sure that whoever is elected is first. That they made sure certain people were selected. So before anybody got elected, they made sure a bunch of people were selected. They made sure certain people were selected. Now, there's something to remember what the Republicans did. The Republicans did something that was novel as well. The Republican National Committee, instead of sitting back and being impartial until after the nomination, the the Republican, and instead of allowing open primaries, not even open primaries, allowing primaries to take place, the RNC, formed a joint committee with Trump's campaign. So now there were Republicans that were running against Trump. And yes, I know Bill Weld was horrible. I knew Bill Weld had no chance in hell. I know this. But what was the harm in actually having the process work out? What was the harm? Like, really, what was the harm? And so for all of the rigging of the primaries on the Democratic side, the Republicans did some shady stuff on their own primaries. So there's enough evidence to look at this and say, and but the thing with the primaries is people got to realize what the primary is. When you're voting in the primaries, you're not actually choosing a government official. You're choosing who is going to be the representative for that party. Meaning, you're choosing who this private corporation, which is what the DNC and RNCs are, who's going to be their guy. Now, there's supposed to be certain rules that are in place. Okay, so you're going with one? Okay. Yeah, and everybody coming in got the question for you. Was the election stolen from Trump? 1 equals yes, 2 equals no. But both the Republicans and Democrats, they changed the rules of their primaries and did stuff that wasn't the way they were supposed to do them according to their own rules. Now they can go back and change the rules, and that's what they often do. But they both did it going into the 2020 election. They both did it. They both did some nonsense. But and the funny thing is, with Trump, he didn't need to do it, but they did it anyway. Because apparently, see, I'm not sure if he was afraid of Weld or if he was afraid that if he had the open primaries, somebody better than Weld would have shown up. Weld was the one that actually showed up regardless. He says, "Okay, I don't care." Okay, Angelina Knox, you say no. Okay, cool, definitely. Because when Bill Weld jumped in, Bill Weld knew he had some money behind him. He knew he had some establishment money behind him. But Bill Weld knew the base did not like him. At least he should have known that. The rest of us knew that. But had the Republicans actually allowed the primaries to go on, the question is, would somebody else, somebody that actually had some kind of traction within the base, would they have been able to step up to the plate and say, okay, I'm actually going to challenge Trump? And is that what he was afraid of? Was he afraid of just having a challenger that was better than Weld and better than him? Especially if you take a look at the year that 2020 was he worried that a Republican was going to step up and say, this dude is a clown. This dude has mishandled this major emergency, this global emergency. We need somebody with some competence. I'm going to do it. And I'm going to save the day. The question is, depending on who that is, I don't know. I'm trying to think of in 2020, there wasn't a Republican that would readily. There wasn't a Republican that was readily obvious that could fit that bill. But who would have? The question is, would a Republican have jumped up and said, "Hey, I'm going to challenge Trump," and Trump was just afraid of that. So the Republicans did the same, did their own shenanigans with their primaries, just basically canceling a bunch of primaries. The RNC forming a joint joint committee with Trump's campaign before he became the official candidate, and all across the board, the Democrats did their nonsense from the Iowa caucuses on. Republicans did their nonsense, and so that's what I will constantly tell people in terms of elections. Like, if you're looking to whether or not an election is rigged, don't look at November 7th, November 6th, November 9th, whenever the election date is held. Look earlier than that. Look earlier than that. Because if you think it's rigged, look at the stuff that happens way before the election. And with these two parties basically running the electoral system, the government, if they can rig their own internal primaries, then that is it's not a direct rigging of the election, but it has a similar effect. So that the election may not be rigged, but if their internal primaries are rigged, then they can accomplish many of the same objectives. And from January, from Iowa. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, we've got a witness getting photographed. I'm trying to figure out who that is. Yeah, well, we saw what New York Board of Elections did in 2020 with the country locked down, with the state locked down. New York State changed the ballot access rules. They eliminated third parties in 2020 during the pandemic. That's what they did. That was their first action. Hey, let's hurry up and change the law while everything's locked down. Let's raise the threshold to get on the ballot. Okay, so I'm not familiar with that Massachusetts GOP primaries. Shiva, I gotta look that up. Shiva. Uh, so yes, Shiva Ayyadurai, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Um, okay, they claimed that he was spreading disinformation. He garnered 3.39% of the vote as an independent candidate in 2018. Ran as a Republican in 2020. Okay, and lost to Kevin O'Connor. Okay, so that's the one you're talking about. Okay, so is he still running for governor this year? 2020. Looks like a really smart guy. Morning, Ricky. Welcome to the channel, Ricky. Yeah, everybody. So far, a couple of people have voted. We got looks like 50-50 so far in terms of whether or not people believe the election was stolen from Trump. Oh yeah, here comes the head of the committee with Liz Cheney. Wow. The only person canvassing across the state for some super unknown won the primaries. At work, watching from the background. All right, awesome. Okay, so let me actually unmute this and get myself off the screen. Welcome, Joshua. Yeah, so I was telling everybody, it's like a grand jury. Don't expect a trial where you get two sides of the case. This is the grand jury where the government is just putting forward their version of events. That's how I'm looking at this.
To investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized.
Let me know if you can hear everything. If there's any sounds, issues with sound, let me know.
Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during today's hearing. Good morning. Last week, the Select Committee laid out a preview of our initial findings about the conspiracy overseen and directed by Donald Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election and block the transfer of power, a scheme unprecedented in American history. My colleagues and I don't want to spend time talking about ourselves during these hearings, but as someone who's run for office a few times, I can tell you at the end of a campaign, it all comes down to the numbers. The numbers tell you the winner and the loser. For the most part, the numbers don't lie. But if something doesn't add up with the numbers, you go to court to get resolution. And that's the end of the line. We accept those results. That's what it means to respect the rule of law. That's what it means to seek elective office in our democracy. Because those numbers aren't just numbers, they're votes. They're your votes. They are the will and the voice of the people. And the very least we should expect from any person seeking a position of public trust is the acceptance of the will of the people, win or lose. Donald Trump didn't. He didn't have the numbers. He went to court. He still didn't have the numbers. He lost. But he betrayed the trust of the American people. He ignored the will of the voters. He lied to his supporters and the country. And he tried to remain in office after the people had voted him out, and the courts upheld the will of the people. This morning, we'll tell the story of how Donald Trump lost an election and knew he lost an election, and as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack on our democracy, an attack on the American people by trying to rob you of your voice in our democracy. And in doing so, lit the fuse that led to the horrific violence of January 6th, when a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol sent by Donald Trump to stop the transfer of power. Today, my colleague from California, Ms. Lofgren, and our witnesses will detail the Select Committee's findings on these matters. But first, I will recognize our distinguished Vice Chair, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week, as the chairman noted, our committee began outlining a 7-part plan overseen by President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. Today, we will begin looking at the initial part of that plan. President Trump's effort to convince millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him by overwhelming fraud. A federal court has already reviewed elements of the committee's evidence on this point and said this, quote, "In the months following the election, numerous credible sources from the president's inner circle to agency leadership and statisticians informed President Trump and Dr. Eastman that there was no evidence of election fraud," close quote, sufficient to overturn the 2020 presidential election. The court's opinion methodically documents each of the principal reasons for that conclusion, and I would urge all those watching to read it. Today, we will begin to show the American people some of our evidence. Today, you will hear much more from former Attorney General Bill Barr's recorded testimony, and you will hear in greater detail what others in the department told President Trump, that his claims of election fraud were nonsense. You will also hear much more from President Trump's own campaign experts, who had also concluded that his fraud claims could not be supported. Let me focus briefly on just 3 points now. First, you will hear firsthand testimony that the president's campaign advisors urged him to await the counting of votes and not to declare victory on election night. The president understood even before the election that many more Biden voters had voted by mail because President Trump ignored the advice of his campaign experts and told his supporters only to vote in person. Donald Trump knew before the election that the counting of those mail-in ballots in several states would not begin until late in the day and would not be complete for multiple days. This was expected, reported, and widely known. You will also hear testimony that President Trump rejected the advice of his campaign experts on election night and instead followed the course recommended by an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop, to falsely claim everything was fraudulent. He falsely told the American people that the election was not legitimate. In his words, quote, "a major fraud." Millions of Americans believed him. Second, pay attention to what Donald Trump and his legal team said repeatedly about Dominion voting machines. Far-flung conspiracies with a deceased Venezuelan communist allegedly pulling the strings. This was, quote, "complete nonsense," as Bill Barr said. President Trump's own campaign advisors, his Department of Justice, and his cybersecurity experts all told him the same thing. Here, for example, is White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. His view was shared by many of the Trump team whom we interviewed.
I thought the Dominion stuff was I never saw any evidence whatsoever to sustain those allegations.
And third, as Mike Pence's staff started to get a sense for what Donald Trump had planned for January 6th, they called the campaign experts to give them a briefing on election fraud and all the other election claims. On January 2nd, the general counsel of the Trump campaign, Matthew Morgan, this is the campaign's chief lawyer, summarized what the campaign had concluded weeks earlier, that none of the arguments about fraud or anything else could actually change the outcome of the election.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
As is obvious, this was before the attack on the Capitol. The Trump campaign legal team knew there was no legitimate argument, fraud, irregularities, or anything to overturn the election. And yet President Trump went ahead with his plans for January 6th anyway. Mr. Chairman, hundreds of our countrymen have faced criminal charges. Many are serving criminal sentences because they believed what Donald Trump said about the election, and they acted on it. They came to Washington, D.C. at his request. They marched on the Capitol at his request. And hundreds of them besieged and invaded the building at the heart of our constitutional republic. As one conservative editorial board put it recently, quote, "Mr. Trump betrayed his supporters by conning them on January 6th, and he is still doing it." Another conservative editorial board that has long supported President Trump said last week, Donald Trump, quote, "won't stop insisting that 2020 was stolen, even though he has offered no proof that that is true." And this, Donald Trump now, quote, "clings to more fantastical theories, such as Dinesh D'Souza's debunked 2,000 mules, even as recounts in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin confirm Trump lost. Those are the correct conclusions to draw from the evidence gathered by this committee. We have much more evidence to show the American people on this point than we can reasonably show in one hearing. But today, we will begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our opening hearing, we gave an overview of our investigation into the January 6th attack. The plot to overthrow the election was complex and had many parts, which we'll explore in remaining hearings. But today, we examine the false narrative that the 2020 election was, quote, stolen. Former President Trump's plan to overturn the election relied on a sustained effort to deceive millions of Americans with knowingly false claims of election fraud. All elements of the plot relied on convincing his supporters about these false claims. Today, we'll demonstrate the 2020 election was not stolen. The American people elected President Joe Biden. We'll present evidence that Mr. Trump's claims of election fraud were false, that he and his closest advisors knew those claims were false, but they continued to peddle them anyway, right up until the moments before a mob of Trump supporters attacked the Capitol. We'll also show that the Trump campaign used these false claims of election fraud to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from supporters who were told their donations were for the legal fight in the courts. But the Trump campaign didn't use the money for that. The big lie was also a big ripoff. The former president laid the groundwork for these false claims well in advance of the election. As early as April 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the only way he could lose an election would be as a result of fraud.
You know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered. And I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location. And then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election.
This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible thing for our country.
There is no
this is not
evidence
going
of
to
that.
end well.
Mr. Trump decided even before the election that regardless of the facts and the truth, if he lost the election, he would claim it was rigged. Mr. Trump was right about one thing. It did not end well. On election night, Mr. Trump claimed even before the votes were counted that his loss was a result of fraud. Now, Thursday, we had testimony from Attorney General Barr about the Department of Justice investigation of Mr. Trump's fraud claims. Barr told Trump directly that his claims were BS. Yet, after hearing the truth and that warning from the AG, Mr. Trump continued to peddle the false claims of fraud. You'll hear detailed testimony from Attorney General Barr describing the various election fraud claims the Department of Justice investigated. He'll tell you how he told Mr. Trump repeatedly that there was no merit to those claims. Mr. Barr will tell us that Mr. Trump's election night claims of fraud were made without regard to the truth and before it was even possible to look for evidence of fraud. Attorney General Barr wasn't alone. You'll see and hear today other Department of Justice officials and senior advisors to Mr. Trump that they told him the claims he was making were not supported by evidence. The election fraud claims were false. Mr. Trump's closest advisors knew it. Mr. Trump knew it. That didn't stop him from pushing the false claims and urging his supporters to, quote, fight like hell, to, quote, take back their country. After he lost the election, various legal challenges were made. You'll hear testimony today from a renowned Republican election litigation lawyer who will explain the normal process by which candidates challenge an election. Rather than accept the results of the election and the decisions of the courts, Mr. Trump pursued a different strategy. He tried to convince the American people the election had been stolen. Many of his supporters believed him, and many still believe him today. The attack on January 6th was a direct and predictable result of Mr. Trump's decision to use false claims of election fraud to overturn the election and to cling to power. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now welcome our first witness. We're joined today by former Fox News politics editor Chris Stirewalt. Bill Stepien, President Trump's former campaign manager, was subpoenaed to be here and was in Washington this morning, prepared to testify. Kevin Marino, Mr. Stepien's attorney, is here with us today. Thank you, Mr. Marino, for coming. And he has advised us that Mr. Stepien's wife went into labor this morning. Mr. Stepien unexpectedly had to travel to be with his wife, and we wish him the best. Due to the depth and rigor of our investigation, we have several hours of Mr. Stepien's testimony from when we interviewed him in February, and we will be presenting that testimony today. I'll now swear in our witness. The witness will please stand and raise his right hand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. I now recognize myself for questions. I want to start by showing a video that tells the story of what was going on in the Trump White House on election night in November of 2020.
you remember where you were on the night of the election, November the 3rd?
I was at the White House.
You know where specifically over the course of that night you spent your time within the White House?
There was an event that was organized in the residence, so I moved between the residence, a room sort of off the residence where some family members were.
I take it the president was upstairs in the residence.
He was upstairs. We were kind of on the first floor, so not upstairs. We were with mostly with Ivanka and her brothers and a couple other people who'd be coming in and out.
Can you just describe the atmosphere? What were people expecting that night when you got to the White House?
I think that there was, typically for people who show up there on election night, it's going to be a self-select, more positive environment. I think people were a little bit nervous, not knowing what was going to happen with the red wave or the red mirage as the debate was being carried out.
The Fox News Decision Desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign.
Arizona's called. Do you remember that?
I do.
What do you remember happening where you were when Arizona was called?
There was surprise at the call.
Who was surprised?
Most everyone in the room.
Were you being one of them?
Yes.
Did that shift the atmosphere, the attitude in the White House?
Completely.
How so? Can you describe that?
Because Fox News was the first one to go out and say that.
So was it anger kind of directed towards Fox News for making a call more so than like disappointment that maybe the campaign lost Arizona?
All the above.
So both anger and disappointment.
Both disappointed with Fox and concerned that maybe our data or our numbers weren't accurate.
Were you in the White House residence during the sort of past midnight into the early morning hours of November 4th?
Yes, oh sure, it went over beyond midnight, yes.
Do you remember Rudy Giuliani being at the White House on election night and into the early hours the next morning?
I do.
What do you remember about when he came?
He was I had heard that he was upstairs, in that aforementioned reception area, and he was looking to talk to the president, and it was suggested instead that he come talk to several of us down off the map room.
You said that you had heard that Mr. Giuliani wanted to talk to the president and then he was directed your way. Did you end up talking to Mr. Giuliani when he was directed your way?
I did.
What was that conversation?
A lot of conversations were directed my way. A few of us, myself, Jason Miller, Justin Clark, and Mark Meadows, gathered in a room off the map room to listen to whatever Rudy presumably wanted to say to the president.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
Like Mayor Giuliani.
Tell me more about that. What was your observation about his potential intoxication during that discussion about what the president should say when he's addressed the nation on election night?
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated, but I do not know his level of intoxication when he spoke with the president, for example.
Were you part of any discussions with the people I mentioned, Mr. Steffi and Mr. Meadows, or anyone else, about whether the president should make any sort of speech on election night?
I mean, I spoke to the president. They may have been present, but President spoke to the president several times that night.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we won it outright?
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
I remember saying that, to the best of my memory, I was saying that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers.
Okay, can you be more specific about that conversation, in particular what Mayor Giuliani said, your response, and then anybody else in the room's response?
I think effectively Mayor Giuliani was saying, we won it. They're stealing it from us. Where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won. And essentially that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
What was your view at the time as to what he should or shouldn't say?
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being counted. It was becoming clear that the race would not be called on election night.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
And did anybody who was a part of that conversation disagree with your message?
Yes.
Who is that?
The president disagreed with that. I don't recall the particular words. He thought I was wrong. He told me so, and that they were gonna go he was gonna go in a different direction.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. We did win this election.
Mr. Stirewalt, did President Trump have any basis to declare victory on November 4th, 2020? Thank you. Mr. Stepien also testified that President Trump had no basis for declaring victory at that point in time.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
Thank you. Mr. Stirewalt, after the votes were counted, who won the presidential election of 2020?
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of the great state of Delaware.
Thank you. That's the bottom line. We've had an election. Mr. Trump lost, but he refused to accept the results of the democratic process. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stirewalt, I'd like you to explain a term that was thrown around a lot during the election, and that's the so-called red mirage. What does that mean?
So in the 40 or 50 years, let's say, that Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or early or absentee, Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans do. So basically, in every election, Republicans win election day and Democrats win the early vote. And then you wait and start counting. And it depends on which ones you count first, but usually it's election day votes that get counted first. And you see the Republicans shoot ahead. And then the process of bailing and binding and unbinding all those mail-in votes. And some states like Pennsylvania refuse to count the votes first. So you have to wait for all of that to come in. So in every election, and certainly a national election, you expect to see the Republican with a lead, but it's not really a lead. When you put together a jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't matter which piece you put in first. It ends up with the same image. So for us, who cares? But that's because no candidate had ever tried to avail themselves of this quirk in the election counting system. We had gone to pains, and I'm proud of the pains we went to make sure that we were informing viewers that this was going to happen, because the Trump campaign and the president had made it clear that they were going to try to exploit this anomaly. And we knew it was going to be bigger because the percentage of early votes was higher, right? We went from about 45% of the votes being early and absentee to, because of the pandemic, that increased by about 50%. So we knew it would be longer. We knew it would be more. So we wanted to keep telling viewers, hey, look, the number that you see here is sort of irrelevant because it's only a small percentage of these votes.
So this red mirage, that's really what you expected to happen on election night.
Happens every time.
Thank you, Mr. Steyerwalt. Now, I'd like to play a clip of Attorney General Bill Barr, who also explains what was expected to happen on election night.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence. And it seemed to be based on the dynamic that at the end of the evening, a lot of Democratic votes came in, which changed the vote counts in certain states. And that seemed to be the basis for this broad claim that there was major fraud. And I didn't think much of that because people had been talking for weeks and everyone understood for weeks that that was going to be what happened on election night.
Mr. Stepien obviously could not be with us today, and it's proper for him to be with his wife as they welcome their child. But he also had discussions with the president about the red mirage. That is, that it would be a long night and that early votes would favor him, but that lots more votes would be counted over the course of the night and the days after. So let's play clip 1 from our interview with Mr. Stepien.
I recounted back to that conversation with him, in which I said, just like I said in 2016 was going to be a long night. I told him in 2020 that it was going to be a process again, as the early returns are going to be positive, and we're going to be watching the returns of ballots as they rolled in thereafter.
So is it fair to say you're trying to present what you thought would be a realistic picture of what might happen over the course of that night, being election night?
That night and the days that followed. Yeah, I always told the president the truth, and I think he expected that from me, and I told him it was going to be a process. It was going to be we're gonna have to wait and see how this turned out. So I just like I did in 2016, I did the same thing in 2020.
So let's watch a short clip of President Trump speaking after he received that information from his campaign advisors.
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
So when former President Trump said that, it contradicted what his advisors had warned would happen. We all know that mail-in ballots played an important role in the 2020 election. However, President Trump continuously discouraged mail-in voting. Mr. Stepien was so concerned about the president's position on mail-in voting that in the summer of 2020, he met with President Trump along with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Let's play clip 4.
Meeting that was had, in particular, I invited Kevin McCarthy to join the meeting, he being of like mind on the issue with me, in which we made our case for why we believed mail-in voting, not to be a bad thing for his campaign. But the president's mind was made up, and you understand, how many times to, go to the well on a particular topic.
Yeah, I understand. Tell me a little bit more about the argument that you and Mr. McCarthy made to the president in that meeting as to why it wasn't a bad thing that mail-in voting was available.
Largely two pillars to that argument, both of which I've previously mentioned. One, leaving a good deal to chance, pushing or urging your voters to vote only on election day leaves a lot to chance. That's A. And B, also previously mentioned, the fact that the Trump campaign, Republican National Committee, Republican Party had an advantage of grassroots workers and volunteers on the ground that would allow, an advantage to enhance return rates of ballots that were mailed. Those were the two pillars of the argument.
I see. And what, if anything, do you recall Representative McCarthy saying during that meeting?
We were echoing the same argument. I mean, his words echoed mine, and vice versa on those two topics.
Mr. Stirewalt, you were at the decision desk at Fox News on election night, and you called Arizona early for President Biden, which was controversial. How did you make that call, and where did you think the race stood in the early hours of the next day?
Well, it was really controversial to our competitors who we beat so badly by making the correct call first. Our decision desk was the best in the business, and I was very proud to be a part of it. Because we had partnered with the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, thanks to my colleague and friend Arnon Mishkin, had built a wonderful device for forecasting the outcomes of elections. So we had a different set of data than our competitors did. We had more research, and we had a better system, and we had a great team. So what you're waiting to see is, do the actual votes match up with the expectations in the poll? The real votes are testing the quality of your poll in targeted precincts and in targeted places. And let me tell you, our poll in Arizona was beautiful, and it was doing just what we wanted it to do, and it was cooking up just right. And at some point, and I forget exactly who, but at some point it became clear that Arizona was getting ready to make a call. So we my boss, Bill Salmon, said, we're not making any call until everybody says yes, because that was always our policy, unanimity. And you have to understand, or in this room, you have, the best people from academia, Democrats, Republicans, a broad cross-section of people who had worked together for a decade, who were really serious about this stuff. So we knew it would be a consequential call because it was one of 5 states that really mattered, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona were the ones that we were watching. We knew it would be significant to call any one of those 5, but we already knew Trump's chances were very small and getting smaller based on what we had seen. So we were able to make the call early. We were able to beat the competition. We looked around the room, everybody says yay, and on we go. And by the time we found out how much everybody was freaking out and losing their minds over this call, we were already trying to call the next state. We had already moved on. We were to Georgia, we were to North Carolina, we were looking at these other states. So we thought we were pleased, but not surprised.
I see. After the election, as of November 7th, In your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point,
Yes.
none. I mean, I guess it's always possible that you could have, a truckload of ballots be found somewhere, I suppose. But once you get into this space, ahead of today, I thought about what are the largest margins that could ever be overturned by a recount, and the kind of stuff that we heard Mike Pence talking about, sounding like a normal Republican that night when he said, we'll keep every challenge. Nothing like that. In a recount, you're talking about hundreds of votes. When we think about calling a race, one of the things that we would think about is it outside the margin of a recount? And when we think about that margin, we think about, in modern history, you're talking about 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes at the way, way outside. Normally, you're talking about hundreds of votes, maybe 300 votes that are going to change. So the idea that through any normal process in any of these states, remember, he had to do it thrice, right? He needed 3 of these states to change. And in order to do that, I mean, you're at an infant, you're better off to play the Powerball than to have that come in.
On November 7th, the other major news outlets called the race for President Biden. Now, Mr. Stepien told the committee that he thought the odds were, and this is a quote, very, very, very bleak, and held a meeting with the president that same day. Let's show clip 8, video clip 8.
I mean, with each day that wore on, I mean, the trajectory of the race on election night, Trump ahead in many states. And as that week wore on, as the 3rd became the 4th, became the 5th, and so on and so forth, and the vote by mail ballots were tabulated, Trump's lead, grew more narrow, and in some places, Biden surpassed, Trump in the vote totals. So as the week wore on, as we paid attention to those numbers multiple times a day, internally, I was feeling less confident for sure.
What was your view on the state of the election at that point?
Very, very, very bleak. We told him, the group that went over there outlined, my belief in chances for success at this point, and then we pegged it at 5, maybe 10% based on recounts that either were automatically initiated or could be initiated based on realistic legal challenges, not all the legal challenges that eventually were pursued. But it was my belief is that it was very, very, 5 to 10%. It's not a very good optimistic outlook.
Now, as President Trump and others continued to claim that the election was stolen, there were lawyers who were a part of the campaign lawyers who were responsible for investigating the fraud claims. That includes Alex Cannon, who could not validate the claims that were being made, including those being made by the president. Let's roll video 13.
This is an email. It's 2 emails, actually. The first is from Alex Cannon to you and Faith McPherson. And then you forward that email on to Mark Meadows, Justin Clark, and Jason Miller, the subject being AZ Federal ID voters. If you look at the original email there, it says, Bill, we completed the AZ analysis you requested. I assume that's about Arizona. And because of the substantial uncertainty surrounding the databases, this is a highly unreliable way to identify ineligible voters. Can you explain the task that you gave to Ms. Cannon for this Arizona analysis?
Sure. Previously, I described some of my frustration with some of the claims that people would throw at President Trump regarding, you need to look at this, this happened in this state or that happened in that state. And it would be, those would flow to us to look into. I talked about that before, I think.
Yep.
you know, this is an example of that. I recall in Arizona, someone had thrown out, I believe this to be the claim, that there were thousands of illegal citizens, people not eligible to vote, having cast their ballots in Arizona. Someone had thrown out that claim to President Trump. And with, you know, the margins being as close as they were, as I previously described, you know, that could potentially matter. So this wild claim is thrown out, which, you know, on its face didn't seem, you know, realistic or possible to me. I asked Alex to look at the, you know, the claim, and I haven't read this full email, but I recall the response to that. The reality of that was not illegal citizens voting in the election. I think it was like overseas voters voting in the election. So obviously, you know, people who were eligible to vote.
When these findings were passed up the chain to President Trump, he became frustrated and he replaced the campaign's legal team. Let's play clip 14.
You know, I think the president, it was during the second week where things like you displayed were occurring, where he was, you know, growing increasingly unhappy with, you know, his team, you know, me, less so because I was less involved at this point, but still me, growing increasingly unhappy with Justin Clark. And that kind of, you know, paved the way for, you know, Justin to be moved out and Mayor Giuliani to be moved in as the person in charge of, you know, the legal side of the campaign, and for all intents and purposes, the campaign at that point.
Now, when Mr. Stepien became campaign manager, he was the second Trump campaign manager for the 2020 race, and there were only about 115 days until Election Day. So let's play the video.
I inherited a campaign that was, the day I was hired was, I believe, President Trump's low point in the 2020 daily average polling against President Biden. It was a campaign at a low point in the polls. It was structurally and fiscally deficient. There was a great deal wrong with the campaign in both of those areas. So most of my day spent fixing what, and I think I took over with 115 days left in the campaign. Most of my time spent fixing the things that could be fixed with 115 days left in the campaign.
Now, Mr. Stepien has been in the campaign field for a long time, and he worked for lots of different candidates and campaigns. He testified to this committee about his concerns given the claims that Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell and their team were making publicly. Let's play clip 15.
Okay, and was it important for you, Mr. Stepien, to sort of pull back just for your own professional reputation? You didn't want to be associated with some of what you were hearing from the Giuliani team and others that sort of stepped in the wake of your departure?
I didn't mind being categorized. There were two groups of, we called them kind of my team and Rudy's team. I didn't mind being characterized as being part of Team Normal, as reporters, kind of started to do around that point in time. I said, hours ago, early on that, I've been doing this for a long time, 25 years, and I've spanned, political ideologies from Trump to McCain to Bush to Christie, and, I can work under a lot of circumstances for a lot of varied, candidates and politicians, but a situation where, and I think along the way, I've built up a pretty good, I hope, a good reputation for being honest and professional. And I I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
So the president did get rid of Team Normal, and I'd like to play a clip showing that the president found the people he needed to perpetuate his claims of fraud.
They saw a big truck bringing in 100,000 ballots in garbage cans, in waste paper baskets, in cardboard boxes, and in shopping baskets. And every single one of them was for Biden because they were being notified by Smartmatic in Frankfurt that Biden was way behind and they better come up with a lot more ballots. And we can prove every single thing I just said. If you gave me the paper ballots, I could probably turn around each one of these states. I'm absolutely convinced if you let me examine each one of those ballots, I'd pull out enough that were fraudulent that it would shake the hell out of the country.
It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden, which we might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm.
I remember that one of the things Mark said at some point was, you can't show an actual vote was flipped, which I found at the time to be a remarkable assertion because you don't have to have the gun to see the body lying on the floor bleeding out with 5 bullet holes in it was killed by a gun.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts. And the theory was also completely nuts, right? I mean, it was a combination of Italians, Germans. I mean, different things have been floating around as to who was involved. I remember Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan. She has an affidavit from somebody who says they wrote a software in, it's something with the Philippines, and just all over the radar.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess, yes.
Tell me what you said.
Basically, not the approach I would take if I was you.
Okay, and how did he react? How did President Trump react when you shared that view with him?
We said, you know, I have confidence in Rudy.
I think I had conversations with probably all of our council who are signed up to assist on election day as they disengaged with the campaign. The general consensus was that the law firms were not comfortable making the arguments that Rudy Giuliani was making publicly. I seem to recall that I had a similar conversation with most all of them.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, you know, I didn't want to be a part of it. And that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did.
Even Sidney Powell, defending herself in a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems, argued that, quote, no reasonable person would conclude that her statements were truly statements of fact. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the witness for joining us today. The first panel is now dismissed. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, we presented the testimony of former Attorney General Bill Barr, who testified before this committee. Today, we present additional evidence, including his testimony that former President Trump started making claims of election fraud immediately after the election, and that Barr concluded the claims were untrue. Now, due to the length of Attorney General Barr's testimony, we're only going to include relevant portions at the hearing today. So let's play the video.
The department, in fact, when we received specific and credible allegations of fraud, made an effort to look into these to satisfy ourselves that they were without merit. And I was in the posture of trying to figure out, there was an avalanche of all these allegations of fraud that built up over a number of days. And it was like playing whack-a-mole, because something would come out one day and then the next day it would be another issue. Also, I was influenced by the fact that all the early claims that I understood were completely bogus and silly, and usually based on complete misinformation. And so I didn't consider the quality of claims right out of the box to give me any, feeling that there was really substance here.
For the first time since the election, the Attorney General spoke personally with the President on November 23rd, and this was at the White House. Let's play the video, please.
So on November 23rd, I hadn't spoken to the president since the election. And in fact, as I said, since the middle of October, roughly. And it was a little getting awkward because obviously he had lost the election and I hadn't said anything to him. And so Cipollone said, I think it's time you come over here. And so I came over to meet with the president in the Oval Office, and Meadows and Cipollone were there. And the president, and this is leading up to this conversation with Kushner, the president said there had been major fraud, and that as soon as the facts were out, the results of the election would be reversed. And he went on this for quite a while, as he's prone to do. And then he got to something that I was expecting, which is to say that apparently the Department of Justice doesn't think that it has a role of looking into these fraud claims. So I said, that has to be the campaign that raises that with the state. The department doesn't take sides in elections, and the department is not an extension of your legal team. And our role is to investigate fraud, and we'll look at something if it's specific, credible, and could have affected the outcome of the election. And we're doing that, and it's just not, they're just not meritorious. They're not panning out. And as I walked out of the Oval Office, Jared was there with Dan Scavino, who ran the president's social media, and who I thought was a reasonable guy and believe is a reasonable guy. And I said, how long is he going to carry on with this stolen election stuff? Where's this going to go? And by that time, Meadows had caught up with me, and leaving the office, and caught up with me and said that he said, look, I think that he's becoming more realistic and knows that there's a limit to how far he can take this. And then Jared said, yeah, we're working on this. We're working on it.
Even after his attorney general told him his claims of election fraud were false, President Trump continued to promote these claims.
I felt that things continued to deteriorate between the 23rd and the weekend of the 29th. And then on November 29th, he appeared on Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Futures, I believe it was. And he said that the department was missing in action.
Well, no, we had glitches where they moved thousands of votes from my account to Biden's account. And these are glitches. So they're not glitches, they're theft. They're fraud, absolute fraud. This election was over. And then they did dumps. They call them dumps, big, massive dumps in Michigan and Pennsylvania and all over. How the FBI and Department of Justice, I don't know, maybe they're involved, but how people are allowed to get away from this stuff with this stuff is unbelievable.
Now, spurred by what he saw, Barr told the Associated Press on December 1st that there was no evidence of election fraud. And immediately after Attorney General Barr's statement went public, Mr. Trump berated and he nearly fired Barr. But Barr persisted in telling the president that there was no evidence to support the fraud claims.
This got under my skin, but I also felt it was time for me to say something. I set up a lunch with the AP reporter, Mike Balsamo, and I told him at lunch, I made the statement that to date, we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. I had a later meeting scheduled at the White House at 3 o'clock with Meadows. This was previously scheduled, so I knew this was going to come up, and I went over there and I told my secretary that I thought I would probably be fired and told not to go home. I mean, not to go back to my office. So I said, you might have to pack up for me. And so when I got over there, I met with the chief of staff. He said the president was angry. He didn't really get into the issue of the fraud. And then I went up to Pat Cipollone's office and we were talking with each other. And the word came down that he wanted us both to go to the Oval. And the president was as mad as I've ever seen him, and he was trying to control himself. And the president said, well, this is, killing me. You didn't have to say this. You must have said this because you hate Trump. You hate Trump. And then he raised the big vote dump, as he called it, in Detroit. And that, he said people saw boxes coming into the counting station at all hours of the morning and so forth. And I explained to him that at that point, I knew the exact number of precincts in Detroit. I think it was 630 something. I said, Mr. President, there are 630 precincts in Detroit. And unlike elsewhere in the state, they centralized the counting process. So they're not counted in each precinct. They're moved to counting stations. And so the normal process would involve boxes coming in at all different hours. So there's nothing. And I said, did anyone point out to you, did all the people complaining about it point out to you, you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time? I mean, there's no indication of fraud in Detroit. And I told him that the stuff that his people were shoveling out to the public was bullshit. I mean, that the claims of fraud were bullshit. And, he was indignant about that. And I reiterated that they'd wasted a whole month on these claims on the Dominion voting machines, and they were idiotic claims. And I specifically raised the Dominion voting machines, which I found to be among the most disturbing allegations, disturbing in the sense that I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegations, but they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public, that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing a grave disservice to the country.
Okay, so the very next day, the president released a video rehashing some of the very same claims that his chief law enforcement officer had told him were, quote, nonsense.
Here's an example. This is Michigan. At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. We have a company that's very suspect. Its name is Dominion. With the turn of a dial or the change of a chip, you can press a button for Trump and the vote goes to Biden. What kind of a system is this?
Barr again told the president that there was nothing to these claims on December 14th?
When I walked in, sat down, he went off on a monologue saying that there was now definitive evidence involving fraud through the Dominion machines. And a report had been prepared by a very reputable cybersecurity firm, which he identified as Allied Security Operations Group. And he held up the report, and then he asked that a copy of it be made for me. And while a copy was being made, he said, you know, this is absolute proof that the Dominion machines were rigged. The report means that I'm going to have a second term. And then he gave me a copy of the report. And as he talked more and more about it, I sat there flipping through the report and looking through it. And to be frank, it looked very amateurish to me. Didn't have the credentials of the people involved, but I didn't see any real qualifications. And the statements were made very conclusory, like, you know, these machines were designed to, you know, engage in fraud or something to that effect, but I didn't see any supporting information for it. And I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, you know, lost contact he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, you know, when I went into this and would, you know, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. In my opinion then, and my opinion now, is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Well, maybe you can assess that 2000 Mules, and people are talking about that.
Well, I mean, just in a nutshell, you know, I just think the GBI was unimpressed with it. And I was similarly unimpressed with it because I think I was holding my fire on that to see what the photographic evidence was, because I thought, well, hell, if they have a lot of photographs of the same person dumping a lot of ballots in different boxes, you know, that's hard to explain. So I wanted to see what the photographic evidence was, but the cell phone data is singularly unimpressive. I mean, it basically, if you take 2 million cell phones and figure out where they are physically in a big city like Atlanta or wherever, just by definition, you're going to find many hundreds of them have passed by and spent time in the vicinity of these boxes. And the premise that, you know, if you go by a box, you know, 5 boxes or whatever it was, you know, that's a mule is just indefensible. It by definition, you're going to have hundreds of this. I mean, I saw one contractor said, we figured out that our truck alone would account for 6 cell phone signals. This was some kind of contractor, and, you know, our route would take us by these things on a regular basis. So but then when the movie came out, you know, I think the photographic evidence in it was completely I mean, there was a little bit of it, but it was lacking. You know, it didn't establish widespread illegal harvesting. The other thing is people don't understand is that it's not clear that even if you can show harvesting, that changes the results of the election. The courts are not going to throw out votes and then figure out, you know, what votes were harvested and throw them out. It's still the burden on the challenging party to show that illegal votes were cast. Votes were the result of undue influence or bribes, or there was really, you know, the person was non-compos mentis. But absent that evidence, I just didn't see courts throwing out votes anyway. I felt that before the election, it was possible to talk sense to the president. And while you sometimes had to engage in, you know, a big wrestling match with him, that it was possible to keep things on track, but I felt that after the election, he didn't seem to be listening, and I didn't think it was, that I was inclined not to stay around if he wasn't listening to advice from me or his other cabinet secretaries.
So on December 14th, Barr quit. Now, the Attorney General wasn't the only person who told the president that his claims were false. Other officials and close advisors told him the same thing.
Rather than try to address a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let me just say there were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, our people have already looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information. That's not correct. It's been demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view. It's been debunked.
A month and a half or so after the election day, and at that meeting, various allegations of fraud were discussed, and Eric and Pat didn't, told the group, the president included, that none of those allegations had been substantiated to the point where they could be the basis for any litigation challenge to the election.
President Trump's own vice president and his top advisors also knew that there wasn't evidence to support the claims that the president was making.
Anyone else other than Mr. Meadows who asked you about the status outside of your legal group, Mr. Morgan and the others you mentioned, anyone else who asked you the status of what you were finding in your assessment of it?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Peter Navarro.
When did you talk to Mr. Navarro?
Mid-November.
Around the same time as Mr. Meadows?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that conversation.
I recall him asking me questions about Dominion and maybe some other categories of allegations of voter fraud. And I remember telling him that I didn't believe the Dominion allegations because I thought the hand recount in Georgia would resolve any issues with the technology problem and with Dominion or Dominion flipping votes. And I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure. And I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state working with Chris Krebs against the president. And I never took another phone call from Mr. Navarro.
Anyone else besides Mr. Meadows, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Hirschman that you had discussions with inquiring about what you were finding in your review of the allegations that were pouring in?
I believe I had about a 15-second conversation with the vice president about it as well.
When was that?
During one of the visits to the White House. I don't know which one. I think it was the first one in November. I had met him briefly at the campaign, and he remembered me and saw me. And he asked what I was doing on the campaign, and I told him that, we were looking into some of the issues related to voter fraud. And he asked me, I don't remember his exact words, but he asked me if we were finding anything. And I said that I didn't believe we were finding it, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter the results of the election. And he thanked me. That was our interaction.
At a later hearing, You'll hear live testimony from the former acting Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Rich Donahue. But now I'd like to play a portion of his testimony.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked at Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false. And then I went into, for instance, this thing from Michigan, this report about 68% error rate. Reality is it was only 0.0063% error rate, less than 1 in 15,000. So the president accepted that. He said, okay, fine, but what about the others? And again, this gets back to the point that there were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation. So then I talked about a little bit about the Pennsylvania truck driver. This is another allegation that had come up. And this claim was by a truck driver who believed, perhaps honestly, that he had transported an entire tractor-trailer truck full of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania. And this was, again, out there in the public and discussed. And I essentially said, look, we looked at that allegation. We looked at both ends, both the people who load the truck and the people who unload the truck. And that allegation was not supported by the evidence. Again, he said, okay. And then he said, no, I didn't mention that one. What about the others? And I said, okay, well, with regard to Georgia, we looked at the tape, we interviewed the witnesses. There is no suitcase. The president kept fixating on this suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots, and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility. There's nothing suspicious about that at all. I told them that there was no multiple scanning of the ballots. One part of that allegation was that they were taking one ballot and scanning it through 3 or 4 or 5 times to rack up votes, presumably for Vice President Biden. I told them that the video did not support that. Then he went off on double voting at the top of the next page. He said, dead people are voting. Indians are getting paid to vote. He meant people on Native American reservations. He said there's lots of fraud going on here. Told him flat out that much of the information he's getting is false and or just not supported by the evidence. We look at the allegations, but they don't pan out.
Mr. Barr and his advisors were not the only ones who determined that the president's allegations regarding Dominion voting machines were false. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing reports issued by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, that addressed and rejected the claims of manipulation of voting machines in the 2020 election.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a report prepared by the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that disproved claims of election fraud in Michigan, as well as a statement by 59 of the country's leading election security scientists, noting the absence of any credible evidence that the 2020 election had been altered through technical compromise, and 5 other reports from organizations and individuals confirming there was no widespread fraud in the 2020 election or describing the spread of the former president's lies.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the order of the committee for today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
So right now, here's how I look at it. I know there's people that disagree. I know there's people that think this is bogus. And I know it's definitely politically. Okay, so Jay, I looked up I'm looking for this case and I can't find it. Is it because like the only 17-year-old they're talking about that was killed was somebody that was like shot by a 44-year-old, and the 44-year-old is on the run right now. So if you have any more details you can give me on that, that would be great. But the interesting thing I'm seeing with this is, okay, yeah, definitely this is something that is politically. Oh, that's the one. Okay. So I got to look at that more. Definitely, this is politically beneficial for the Democrats. Just because it's politically beneficial for the Democrats doesn't mean it's not without some merit. So, because they're laying out the case of how ridiculous Trump was being. And so there are people that believe that Trump actually won the election. And I got to give them credit for why. So here's the thing, because let's take all of the people that believe that Trump actually won the election. Then you definitely want there to be a hearing. You definitely want this information to be covered, to be discussed, to be investigated. Because if you believe that Trump actually won the election, then you actually want to make sure that there's an investigation conducted. Now, you may think that these individuals are not actually looking into the claims that the election was stolen. Okay, so that's what it is. Yeah, because I saw the article and I'm like, I assumed it had to be something different. But yeah, I'm going to look into it to see if they provide any more details. But here's the thing. So with regards to this, the claims that the election is stolen, you want an investigation. Now, if you're saying that, okay, they're not actually trying to investigate, this part is very important. Like this part, what they're doing isn't just talking about January 6th. They're talking about the actual election and whether or not the election was stolen. And so now there are several people that were in Trump's vicinity that are saying the election wasn't stolen. Now, you've got Giuliani still going with what he's saying. You've got Sidney Powell saying what she's saying. But now remember, they bring up Sidney Powell going to court for defamation because the minion sued her. And she's like, oh, you can't take me seriously. And so this is the stuff that you need to, if we're going to have a discussion about whether or not this election was stolen, the 2020 election was stolen, okay, then let's have this discussion. Because I see a lot of people on the right saying, oh, this is bogus, this is bull. But if we're not going to have the discussion about the election being stolen, then was the election actually stolen? Because if the election was stolen, that's definitely something we've got to discuss. Now, if you think that there's information that they're not providing, okay, but then this is what you need to be watching to be able to say, look, they didn't cover this, they didn't talk about this, or they lied about this, they lied about that. If you're not watching the hearing, you're not even going to be able to break down what you feel they've lied about, what information you feel they've omitted. And I'm like, okay, yeah, because I want to see, not what I'm looking for now is people that have believed that the election was actually stolen. I hope they're watching today, because this is the day. And if they're not watching today, I'm actually going to I'll probably put together some key clips from this so that, like, this is the day you need to watch. If you believe the election was stolen, this is the day more than any other day that you need to be watching, that you need to be paying attention to, and that you need to be saying, oh, they missed this, they missed that, or if you believe the election was stolen and you're willing to hear evidence, if you listen to today's testimony and go, huh, okay, so maybe I was wrong. Maybe the election wasn't stolen. But this hearing is got to be part of the discussion if you're going to claim that the election was stolen. Because we're seeing Trump's campaign spokesman, correction, not his campaign spokesman, his campaign chairman, the head of Trump's campaign is like, I mean, come on, this is ridiculous. He's calling he's calling Giuliani and Powell loons. Like we're the normal ones. They're, space cadets. You've got Barr. Okay, so then people are gonna say, oh, well, Barr is compromised. At a certain point, you start to, case in point, like it's like Amber Heard saying when everybody came up and testified, okay, no, I didn't see this with Johnny. Johnny's really nice. And then people are like, okay, at some point people have to start looking like everybody's lying except you. And so now you have to look at Trump. Is everybody's out to get him? Everybody's against him except for you see what I'm saying? Thank you, Jay. If one person said the election was stolen, that's all Trump needed. Like that's literally all Trump needed. Trump didn't need any evidence. If you said the election was stolen, you're Trump's best buddy. He brought in Giuliani, brought in City. Okay, and they pushed out his old legal team. Like what? Barr is telling him, okay, listen, give me evidence, I'll investigate. And then we're seeing people, officials saying we've investigated this, it's nonsense. We've investigated this, it doesn't pan out. Okay, these claims being made, no, that's not out of the ordinary. People that don't know what the procedure are seeing things and saying and inventing nefarious motives around them. Oh, there's boxes going in and out. Like, yeah, that's the ballots. They move the ballots in and out like this. They have to move the ballots in something. The ballots are in the boxes. But people are automatically assuming it's fake ballots. Like, no, those are real ballots. How are the real ballots going to get inside the building where they're being counted? They get transported in boxes. But it's happening at all hours of the night. Yes, because the election just happened and we need to keep counting these until we're done. Like this is something that's fairly important, so we gotta keep counting. So, and I haven't seen 2,000 Mules. I'm not gonna pay. I'm definitely not paying to see 2,000 Mules. But in order to, if I come across some information from it, I'll check it out. But that, like, at this point, I got to compare. Like, what are people basing these arguments on? I'm really trying to figure out what are people basing these arguments on, because it's not. Right now, he's looking like a fool right now. With the case that they're putting on right now, Trump looks absolutely ridiculous. And the people that he chose around him look like clowns. Because there's a bunch of people that were already around him that appear to be incompetent and able to do things that are like, no, this is ridiculous. This doesn't make sense. You got people actually leaving because they're like, are y'all still with this nonsense? And so I really want to see what those individuals who are saying that the election was stolen, are you saying that you believe the election was stolen? Are you saying that you feel the election was stolen? Or are you saying that you have evidence and you've seen evidence. I'm not saying necessarily that you personally have the evidence, but that you've seen evidence that the election was stolen. So those are all three different things. If you believe it, it's different than feeling it, and it's definitely different from knowing that the election and having seen evidence that the election was stolen. Somehow I thought that this was just okay. Maybe I didn't look at the clock right, but I thought that the break. Well, there's new witnesses have shown up, so let me show you them. The committee's still on recess, but these new people sat down, and now they're getting their photos taken. They're posing for the cameras. So Smith, Pack, and I think this is Ginsburg. Pack, Smith, and Ginsburg. Pack, January 6th. Okay, so he's a former U.S. Pack is a former U.S. attorney. B.J. Pack, former Atlanta-based U.S. attorney, will testify. He was appointed to his former role by Trump in 2017. He abruptly left his position in January 2021, just days before the 6th. So Trump, apparently he had static with Trump because he didn't investigate. Trump was angry at the lack of investigation into his claims of voter fraud. This is a crazy performance from the Democrats. They are back. They're about to get started. Ben Ginsburg. Okay,
Committee will be in order. I now welcome our second panel of witnesses. We're joined today by B.J. Pack, Al Smith, and Ben Ginsburg. Mr. Pack is a former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. Mr. Smith is a former city commissioner for the city of Philadelphia, where he served for more than 10 years. Mr. Ginsburg is one of the leading election law attorneys in the country and has represented Republican presidential candidates in election litigation dating back to 2000, where he represented George W. Bush in the Bush v. Gore litigation. I will now swear in our witnesses. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Loughman, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the break, I think you all heard Mr. Barr and Mr. Donahue talk about the false claims that Mr. Trump and his supporters made about suitcases of fake ballots in Georgia. We have a witness here today who thoroughly investigated that issue. Mr. Pack, I want to thank you for appearing before us today. You were appointed by President Trump to serve as a U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and you served from 2017 until January of 2021. You were the lead federal prosecutor there and worked for the Department of Justice under then Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, were you ever asked by Attorney General Barr to investigate claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election? And if so, what were those claims?
Thank you, Congressman Loughran. Thank you for the question. Approximately December 4th, I believe, of 2020, Attorney General Barr and I had a conversation about an unrelated case to the case at issue. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Barr had asked me if I had seen a certain videotape that was being reported in the news where Mr. Giuliani, in a Senate subcommittee hearing that was held the day before, May 3rd, showed a videotape of a purportedly a security tape at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, which is also in Fulton County in the city of Atlanta. Yes. At the time, Mr. Barr asked me that he had made a public statement that he had not seen any widespread election fraud that would question the outcome of the election. And because of the videotape and the serious allegation that Mr. Giuliani was making with respect to the suitcase full of ballots purported in the video, he asked me to find out what I could about it, because he had envisioned that in some days after
Just getting that up right now.
At Optimum Business, little by little, we're making big changes, like an improved network that never slows you down for only.
Conducted its own investigation.
we found that the suitcase full of ballots, the alleged black suitcase that was being seen pulled from under the table, was actually an official lockbox where ballots were kept safe. We found out that there was a mistake in terms of a misunderstanding that they were done counting ballots or tallying ballots for the night. And the partisan watchers that was assigned by each of the respective parties were announced to send home. But once they realized the mistake, someone from the Secretary of State's office had indicated that, no, we're not done for the night. You need to go ahead and continue counting. So once they packed up the lockbox full of ballots, they brought back the official ballot box again and continue to tally the ballots from the lockbox. Unfortunately, during the Senate hearing, Mr. Giuliani only played a clip that showed them pulling out the official ballot box from under the table and referring to that as a smoking gun of fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
Thank you very much. I'd like to play again a testimony from Mr. Donahue, who appeared before the committee before today.
Mr. Donahue, we talked at some length about whether or not the White House or the president was informed about the Antrim report. On the results of the investigations, the interviews that have gone on Fulton County, how would those results have been communicated to the White House, to the president?
I don't know how they were initially communicated. I do know that they came up in subsequent conversations with the president, and Dad Rose and I essentially told him, we looked into that, and it's just not true.
Okay, so he was informed.
I told the president myself that several times in several conversations, that these allegations about ballots being smuggled in a suitcase and run through the machine several times, it was not true. That we looked at the video, we interviewed the witnesses, it was not true.
Mr. Pack, after you left the U.S. Attorney's Office on January 4th, 2021, did the next U.S. Attorney there, I think Mr. Trump's personal pick, Bobby Christine, did he investigate any remaining claims of fraud? And if so, did he find any evidence that supported the president's claims of voter fraud?
It is my understanding that Mr. Christine continued any investigations that were pending at the time of my departure, but he was unable to find any evidence of fraud that affected the outcome of the election.
So after investigating the president's and Mr. Giuliani's claims about voter fraud in Georgia, is it your view today that there was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to undermine confidence in the outcome of the election in Georgia?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Pack. And I want to thank you also for the service that you've given to our country. We appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn to President Trump's false allegations about election integrity in Philadelphia. The Attorney General discussed these allegations at some length.
You know, the idea, the president has repeatedly suggested that there was some kind of outpouring of unexpected votes in inner city areas like Philadelphia as recently as January 13th when he walked off the NPR set. He was asked by the interviewer, what's your evidence of fraud? And he said more people voted in Philadelphia than there were voters. And that was absolute rubbish. The turnout in Philadelphia was in line with the state's turnout. And in fact, it was not as impressive as many suburban counties. And there was nothing strange about the Philadelphia turnout. It wasn't like there was all these unexpected votes that came out in Philadelphia. So, I think once you actually look at the votes and then there's an obvious explanation. For example, in Pennsylvania, Trump ran weaker than the Republican ticket generally. He ran weaker than two of the state candidates. He ran weaker than the congressional delegation running for federal Congress, and he ran weaker than the Republican, I think. I haven't looked at this recently, but he generally was a weak element on the Republican ticket. So that does not suggest that the election was stolen by fraud.
How about Pennsylvania and Bill McSwain? We were talking to the U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia about an alleged discrepancy between the number of absentee ballots issued and the number of ballots cast.
Right. So that was one of the big ones for a period of time. I think that was raised at Gettysburg by Giuliani or something like that, but it kept on being repeated, and I found it annoying because it didn't seem that it was right. So I called McSwain, and he got back to me. He said, no, the problem is that Mastriano threw out this number. And what he did was he mixed apples and oranges. He took the number of applications for the Republican primary and he compared it to the number of absentee votes cast in the general election. But once you actually go and look and compare apples to apples, there's no discrepancy at all. And, that's one of the, I think at some point I covered that with the president.
We have another witness here today who has detailed knowledge about the election process in Philadelphia. Mr. Schmidt, at the time of the 2020 presidential election, you were serving as the only Republican member of Philadelphia's three-member city commission, which is responsible for overseeing elections throughout the city. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressperson.
So President Trump made numerous claims regarding fraudulent voting practices in Philadelphia, including the claim that dead people were voting In fact, Mr. Giuliani told Pennsylvania state legislators that 8,000 dead people voted in Pennsylvania. You investigated those claims of voter fraud. Can you tell us what you found?
Not only was there not evidence of 8,000 dead voters voting in Pennsylvania, there wasn't evidence of 8. We took seriously every case that was referred to us, no matter how fantastical, no matter how absurd, and took every one of those seriously, including these.
As it turns out, even Mr. Trump's campaign lawyers knew that the dead voter claims weren't valid.
I guess the crooks in Philadelphia are disappointed in this. They only submitted 8,021 ballots from dead people, mail-in ballots for dead people. Probably easier for dead people to submit mail-in ballots than it is to vote in person.
Rudy was at this stage of his life and the same ability to manage things at this level or not. And obviously, I think Bernie Kerik publicly said it. They never proved the allegations that they were making and they were trying to develop.
Mr. Schmidt, on November 11th, 2020, President Trump tweeted about you saying, and here's a quote, "A guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican or rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption, dishonesty. We win." As a result of that tweet and the CNN interview you gave where you stated the dead voter claims in Pennsylvania were false, you and your staff were subjected to disturbing threats. Can you tell us about that?
The threats prior to that tweet, and on some level, it feels almost silly to talk about a tweet, but we can really see the impact that they have, because prior to that, the threats were pretty general in nature. Corrupt election officials in Philadelphia are going to get what's coming to them. You're what the Second Amendment is for. You're walking into the lion's den, all sorts of things like that. After the president tweeted at me by name, calling me out the way that he did, the threats became much more specific, much more graphic, and included not just me by name, but included members of my family by name, their ages, our address, pictures of our home, just every bit of detail that you could imagine. That was what changed with that tweet.
Behind me are redacted threats that you received, that you provided to the committee. Now, we redacted portions of the text to protect your family. Mr. Schmidt, I think I speak for all of my colleagues when I say we are deeply sorry for what you and your loved ones have been through. And I also want to thank you for your service to your country and for standing up for the rule of law. I want to thank both Mr. Pack and Mr. Schmidt for their service, their testimony, and for standing up for the rule of law. Now I'd like to turn to another subject. The courts in our country provide a legitimate venue for campaigns to challenge what they view as irregular election practices. Now, courts have the final say on how the law applies to those challenges. We have a renowned legal expert here to address the Trump campaign's activities in court. Mr. Ginsburg, you've spent your entire career representing Republicans in election-related litigation. You served as the National Counsel on Republican presidential campaigns in 2000, in 2004, and in 2012. You played a key role in the 2000 Florida recount that led to the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore. You served as the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. I think it's fair to say you're the most prominent Republican lawyer who's litigated in the election field. Now, you've analyzed the Trump campaign's litigation pretty carefully. What's the normal process for post-election litigation? How is the Trump campaign's different from the kinds of post-election litigation you've been involved in and know about?
In the normal course of things, any campaign on the night of the election and in the days after will do a couple of different things. One is that they'll analyze precinct results to look for abnormalities in the results, and they'll send people to those precincts to ask more questions. Secondly, all campaigns will have poll watchers and poll workers and observers in the polling place. And so campaigns will talk to those people if they saw any irregularities that could cause problems in the election. Now, the Trump campaign talked pre-election about having 50,000 poll workers. So presumably, they did have eyes on the ground in all these places. And so in the normal course of things, a campaign will analyze the reports that come in. Trump campaign had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close. In 2000, that was 537 and close. In this election, the most narrow margin was 10,000 and something in Arizona, and you just don't make up those sorts of numbers in recounts. And when the claims of fraud and irregularities were made, you've heard very compelling testimony from Mr. Stepien, from Matt Morgan, from Alex Cannon about those claims and how they didn't believe them. And so that put the Trump campaign on sort of a process of bringing cases without the actual evidence that you have to have in which the process is designed to bring out.
So are you aware of any instance in which a court found the Trump campaign's fraud claims to be credible?
No, there was never that instance. In all the cases that were brought, and I've looked at the more than 60 that include more than 180 counts. And no, the simple fact is that the Trump campaign did not make its case.
The Select Committee has identified 62 post-election lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and his allies between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. Those cases resulted in 61 losses and only a single victory, which actually didn't affect the outcome for either candidate. Despite those 61 losses, President Trump and his allies claim that the courts refused to hear them out, and as a result, they never had their day in court. Mr. Ginsburg, what do you say about the claims that Mr. Trump wasn't given an opportunity to provide the evidence they had of voter fraud? Did they have their day in court?
They did have their day in court. About half of those cases that you mentioned were dismissed at the procedural stage for a lack of standing. The proper people didn't bring the case, or there wasn't sufficient evidence and it got dismissed on a motion to dismiss. But in the other, there was discussion of the merits that was contained in the complaints. And in no instance did a court find that the charges of fraud were real. And it's also worth noting that even if the Trump campaign complained that it did not have its day in court, there have been post-election reviews in each of the 6 battleground states that could have made a difference. And those ranged from the somewhat farcical Cyber Ninjas case in Arizona to the Michigan Senate report that was mentioned earlier, the hand recount in Georgia that Mr. Pack addressed. And in each one of those instances, there was no credible evidence of fraud produced by the Trump campaign or his supporters.
Thank you. As Mr. Ginsburg has explained, there are no cases where the Trump campaign was able to convince a court that there was widespread fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election. Over and over, judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans alike directly refuted this false narrative. They called out the Trump campaign's lack of evidence for its claims, and the judges did that even in cases where they could have simply thrown out the lawsuit without writing a word. You can see behind me a few excerpts from the decisions in these 62 cases. The Trump campaign's lack of evidence was criticized by judges across the political spectrum. In Pennsylvania, a Trump-appointed judge concluded, quote, charges require specific allegations and proof. We have neither here. Another Trump-appointed judge warned that if cases like these succeeded, quote, any disappointed loser in a presidential election able to hire a team of clever lawyers could flag claimed deviations from election results and cast doubt on election results. The list goes on and on. Allegations are called, quote, an amalgamation of theories, conjecture, and speculation. In another, strained legal arguments without merit, unsupported by evidence, derived from wholly unreliable sources, a fundamental and obvious misreading of the Constitution. The rejection of President Trump's litigation efforts was overwhelming. 22 federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, including 10 appointed by President Trump himself, and at least 24 elected or appointed Republican state judges dismissed the president's claims. At least 11 lawyers have been referred for disciplinary proceedings due to bad faith and baseless efforts to undermine the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Rudy Giuliani had his license to practice law suspended in New York. And just this week, a newly filed complaint will potentially make his suspension from practicing law in DC permanent. And as we've just heard from perhaps the most preeminent Republican election lawyer in recent history, the Trump campaign's unprecedented effort to overturn its election laws in court was a deeply damaging abuse of the judicial process. As stated by U.S. District Court Judge David Carter, this was, quote, a coup in search of a legal theory. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for today's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The second panel of witnesses is now dismissed. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for a closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now that we understand the litigation efforts by President Trump and his allies, I'd like to present additional actions taken by the Trump campaign during this time. President Trump continued to push the stolen election narrative, even though he and his allies knew that their litigation efforts making the same claim had failed. It's worth pointing out that litigation generally does not continue past the safe harbor date of December 14th. But the fact that this litigation went on, well, that decision makes more sense when you consider the Trump campaign's fundraising tactics. Because if the litigation had stopped on December 14th, there would have been no fight to defend the election and no clear path to continue to raise millions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd ask for unanimous consent to include in the record a video presentation describing how President Trump used the lies he told to raise millions of dollars from the American people. These fundraising schemes were also part of the effort to disseminate the false claims of election fraud.
Without objection, so
My name is Amanda Wick, and I'm Senior Investigative Counsel with the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Between Election Day and January 6th, the Trump campaign sent millions of fundraising emails to Trump supporters, sometimes as many as 25 a day. The emails claimed the, quote, left-wing mob was undermining the election, implored supporters to, quote, step up to protect the integrity of the election and encouraged them to, quote, fight back. But as the Select Committee has demonstrated, the Trump campaign knew these claims of voter fraud were false, yet they continued to barrage small dollar donors with emails, encouraging them to donate to something called the Official Election Defense Fund. The Select Committee discovered no such fund existed.
I don't believe there is actually a fund called the Election Defense Fund.
Is it fair to say the Election Defense Fund was another, I think we called it a marketing tactic?
Yes.
And tell us about these funds as marketing tactics.
Just a topic matter, where money could potentially go to be, how money could potentially be used.
The claims that the election was stolen were so successful, President Trump and his allies raised $250 million, nearly $100 million in the first week after the election. On November 9th, 2020, President Trump created a separate entity called the Save America PAC. Most of the money raised went to this newly created PAC, not to election-related litigation. The Select Committee discovered that the Save America PAC made millions of dollars of contributions to pro-Trump organizations, including $1 million to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' charitable foundation, $1 million to the America First Policy Institute, a conservative organization which employs several former Trump administration officials, $204,857 to the Trump Hotel Collection, and over $5 million to Event Strategies, Inc., the company that ran President Trump's January 6th rally on the Ellipse.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
The evidence developed by the Select Committee highlights how the Trump campaign aggressively pushed false election claims to fundraise, telling supporters it would be used to fight voter fraud that did not exist. The emails continued through January 6th, even as President Trump spoke on the Ellipse. 30 minutes after the last fundraising email was sent, the Capitol was breached.
Every American is entitled and encouraged to participate in our electoral process. Political fundraising is part of that. Small dollar donors use scarce disposable income to support candidates and causes of their choosing, to make their voices heard. And those donors deserve the truth about what those funds will be used for. Throughout the committee's investigation, we found evidence that the Trump campaign and its surrogates misled donors as to where their funds would go and what they would be used for. So not only was there the big lie, there was the big ripoff. Donors deserve to know where their funds are really going. They deserve better than what President Trump and his team did. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank all of our witnesses today. And I'd also like to, in particular, wish Mr. Stepien and his family all the best on the arrival of a new baby. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, was very narrowly focused. And in the coming days, you will see the committee move on to President Trump's broader planning for January 6th, including his plan to corrupt the Department of Justice and his detailed planning with lawyer John Eastman to pressure the vice president, state legislatures, state officials, and others to overturn the election. Let me leave you today with one clip to preview what you will see in one of our hearings to come. This is the testimony of White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. John Eastman called Mr. Hirschman the day after January 6th, and here is how that conversation went.
I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
At the conclusion of last week's hearing, we showed you a video of rioters explaining why they had come to Washington on January 6th. It was because Donald Trump told them to be here. Today, we heard about some of the lies Donald Trump embraced and amplified when it became clear he didn't have the numbers of votes to win the election. We heard about how officials at different levels of government explored claims of fraud and found no evidence. Yet the former president continued to repeat those false claims over and over again. Today, we'll end things where we did on Thursday, back on January 6th, hearing words of individuals who wanted to stop the transfer of power. We know they were there because of Donald Trump. Now we hear some of the things they believed. Without objection, I enter into the record a video presentation.
I know exactly what's going on right now. Fake election. They think they're gonna fucking cheat us out of our vote and put communist fucking Biden in office. It ain't fucking happening today, buddy. You voted?
Yes, sir.
How'd it go?
Voted early. It went well, except for the can't really trust the software. Dominion software all over.
We voted, and right in the top right-hand corner of the Dominion voting machine that we used, there was a Wi-Fi symbol with 5 bars. So that most definitely connected to the internet, without a doubt. So they stole that from us twice. We're not doing it anymore. We're not taking it anymore. So we're standing up, we're here, and whatever happens, we're not laying down again.
I'm from Pennsylvania. It didn't work. It absolutely worked. It didn't work. No. Trust the system. 200,000 people that weren't even registered voted. 430,000 votes disappeared from President Trump's tally. And you can't stand there and tell me that it worked.
I don't want to say that what we're doing is right. But if the election's being stolen, what is it going to take?
The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. So before we leave, I wanted to quickly, because Papa Hotep, apparently you seen 2,000 Mules, and you believe that the election was stolen. So let me tell you what I think today is so important, especially for people that believe, feel, know, think that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. Because today they were talking all about the election. So I encourage, if you or anybody else, because they go over a bunch of stuff and they're providing interviews with people that were in Trump's circle at the time. And they're asking them, okay, so what about this? What about this? They're talking about investigations that were conducted. They're talking about, okay, what about these claims? They talk about how Giuliani is coming into, the night of the election. Everybody else is like, okay, it's still early. We need to do some more counting. And Giuliani is like, okay, no, we just got to declare victory. See, so I think if you believe that the election was stolen, this is the day, I think definitely more than Thursday night, this is the day you want to watch. Because this deals specifically with many issues of whether or not the election was actually stolen. So this is because today's focus was less on the riot and more on whether or not the election was stolen. So yeah, I'm curious to see if once you see some more of it, I would really want to see your perspective on what your opinion is. If you think how you think it compares in contrast with stuff from like 2,000 Mules, because I have not seen 2,000 Mules yet. I know it's behind a paywall. I'm not paying for it. But if I get to see it without having to pay for it, if it's made freely available, then I'll check it out to just see, because I'm curious as to what the claims are. I want to know what the claims are to support, okay, the election was stolen. What is the evidence being provided? Because today's hearing was about the election wasn't stolen, and here's how we know the election wasn't stolen. This claim was made. It was, so 2,000 Mules, Kenny, is, I'm not sure if you heard of it, from Dinesh D'Souza. Well, and funny thing, they actually gave Dinesh D'Souza a shout out in this hearing, where I think it was Liz Cheney. Yeah, Liz Cheney actually gives him a shout out and says, what the evidence that we've uncovered completely debunks 2,000 Mules. Now so I'm curious what a person who has seen 2,000 Mules says once they see today's presentation, and then compares it. Because basically 2,000. So you may say, "Oh, this is a biased version of the events." Yes, which is what 2,000 Mules is. 2,000 Mules is a perspective of somebody who believes the election was stolen. That's their evidence of why the election was stolen. So if you want the trial, you compare this hearing, today's hearing, January 6th hearing, committee hearing, with the 2,000 Mules and see what makes sense. That's why I think would be a really great comparison. It exposes everything. It shows ballots being stuffed, and they actually have routes. They had all their stops on GeoTrack. Okay, so question: is there any officials that are involved that have actually prosecuted anybody? Like, is there, because some of the stuff that they're talking about, they talked about they talked about people complaining about boxes of ballots being brought in to precincts at all times of night. And Bob Barr was like, yes, because that's how boxes of ballots are brought in. People are just assuming, oh, these are fake ballots. Those are real ballots. Like, the ballots have to be counted. That's what they do. They bring the ballots in these boxes, and people were assuming that this wasn't accurate. This wasn't real ballots, and this was something nefarious going on. When in fact, they say no, it was just business as usual. But it's happening because the election just happened. It's a fairly important thing, so it's going throughout the night. They're just, okay, keep going. Let's just keep counting, because we have to get these totals tallied up to find out who won the election. But I'm going to look to see if I can find some more information from 2,000 Mules, because I want to compare and contrast the information in 2,000 Mules with information we see here, because they made a pretty good case today, and including with a whole bunch of people that are connected to Trump who are like, this is some nonsense. And we were telling him it was some nonsense, and they were coming to us with nonsense. And they're saying the people are coming to them with claims. Every day it's something different. And they're like, okay, oh, it's ballot harvesting. Oh, they're changing the algorithm. Oh, they're stealing votes. Oh, they're having illegals vote. Oh, they're having Native Americans vote. Like, what? So it was like they were trying to just throw the way they presented it today, made it look as if they were just trying to throw something against the wall and see if anything stuck. And Bob Barr is like, if you have some credible evidence, we investigate. Otherwise, we're not just like no. And then there's other investigators who say, okay, they gave us this information, we checked it out, it was not credible, it was nonsense. And event after event after event, they're saying, no, this stuff isn't panning out. And then you get to the 62 cases, and of the 62, now this is the thing I want to see. They said they have 62 election challenges, won. So 61 lost, but I want to find out what is that one that lost. There was that one that won. I want to find that, do some research into that. I think one of the mules flipped, and though is cooperating, no indictments as far as I know. Okay. All of the evidence should be brought up in the courts at the time. Absolutely, definitely. And it's like saying that only Trump was affected and no other Republican running. That's another good point. And that's what I'm saying. They really made a good case today because of how many Republicans, and not just Republicans, but people that was actually close to Trump, people that was connected to Trump, that were like, yeah, this doesn't make sense. And even people like Stepien, you can tell Bill Stepien was supposed to appear today. He backed out because he doesn't want to piss Trump off. But he knows, like, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. And that's why he wound up, he said that Trump pushed his team aside to bring in, because like he says, him and his team was team normal. He pushed them out the way to bring in the clown show, which is what he's referring to, Giuliani and Sidney Powell. And then, and this was crazy. When Sidney Powell gets sued for defamation and says, oh, nobody should take me seriously. Like at that point in time, that's a pretty, if the main person that's making these very loud claims, these very huge claims, says, oh, you can't take me seriously. I'm just making stuff up. Like at that point, that's a serious, severe blow to the case that the election is stolen. Well, if people have been bribed and threatened, not too many people are going to open that can of worms. But we need actual evidence. We can't just assume that it happened if we don't have actual evidence. Because it's just Kennedy, they only voted for the Democratic president candidate. Bribed. So why didn't Republicans lose state seats or other seats in Congress? Yeah, I mean, the numbers don't appear to support the claims that the election was stolen. But like I said, I want to see what kind of stuff is 2000 Mules saying. Because I'm seeing, a lot of times I'll see that same thing that I'm talking about in terms of people saying, oh yeah, they were changing, the Dominion machines changed votes. And there was mules bringing in fake votes. And there was dead people voting. And there was people that were paid to vote for the Democrats. And there were people that were voting twice. And I'm like, okay, there's a whole lot of stuff that's going on here. Like, do you have evidence of any of it? Because if all of that stuff happened, then, you see what I'm saying? Because at this point, okay, how did they successfully steal the election? Did the machines change votes? Because if the machines change votes, which was one of the claims, then what are these mules that they're talking about? Because you didn't need the mules because you have people that you have the machine that can actually change the votes. Okay, but let's say they actually decided we're going to try to steal the election on so many different fronts, which is actually kind of reckless, because if you're trying to commit the same crime from different in 5 different ways, you're increasing the possibility that at least one of those people is going to get caught. One avenue is going to get exposed, and then the jig is up. The gig is up. The jig is up. So that's why there seems to be some deficiency with some of the arguments that the election was stolen. In other words, they didn't mess with Republican tickets. And how did one company that was in one state control all the outcomes? Nope. Okay. But yeah, because it's, and so, and that's why I want to see, I really want people that believe And I'm glad that Fox News played it today. Although, so here's a really good point, because there's a lot of people I've seen that are saying they didn't steal it with voting machines. They did it with overprinting mails and ballots. Okay, but you see, now here's where you got to realize this is severely undermining the credibility of a lot of people, because they've said that the machines were crooked. The machines were crooked. The ballots, the machines were changing votes. This is a claim that was made. So now, if they're saying, okay, no, it wasn't that, it was this, you're getting to a point of crying wolf. We're getting to a point where people on Trump's side are crying wolf, and at some point, people are going to stop investigate. Like, in terms of, if you keep coming to me saying, oh, this happened over here. Oh, this happened. No, it was this. Like, okay, we don't have time to keep playing these games. Do you have evidence that this happened? If you have evidence, provide it. If you don't, what are we talking about? And so if Trump's supporters, not even Trump supporters, this is Trump's like circle. These are people that were standing with Trump on stage. These are people that Trump brought in, Giuliani and them, Sidney Powell, Trump himself saying this stuff. So now for Trump to say that the Dominion voting machines were changing votes, and now people are like, okay, no, that's not what happened. At some point, people have to start looking at Trump skeptically. At some point, people have to start looking like Trump. You're full of it because you said this is what it was, and it's not. So even if it is something else, where did you get this information from? You were just making stuff up? Because now that's what you're saying is Trump can't be taken at his word. Well, some of us already don't take Trump at his word. Some of us have already seen Trump say a whole bunch of fraudulent stuff and know, okay, yeah, I'm not taking this dude at his word. I don't have a dog in this fight, but they wrote an article in the Time magazine. Listen, let me tell you this. I do have a dog in this fight. Do you know why I have a dog in this fight? Because if the election was stolen, it doesn't matter that I didn't vote for Donald Trump. It doesn't matter that I didn't vote for Joe Biden. If the election was stolen, that means that when I vote next time, if my candidate actually has a good chance of winning, the vote can be stolen again. So I definitely have a dog in the fight. Why? Because I'm in the United States of America. I'm in the United States of America. I am subject to their laws. So yes, I have a dog in the fight. Because if they stole the election, if they stole a presidential election, that means they can do it again. If they didn't steal a presidential election, I have a dog in the fight. Why? Because then that means that there are millions and millions of people. And how many people still believe the election was stolen? There are millions and millions of people that are running around with a conspiracy theory that isn't true because they're listening to this politician, to this dude that has significant influence, and he's lying to them. And they're being lied to. So one way or another, I'm in this country. I've got a dog in the fight. The way I figure it, we all got a dog in the fight. But that's my perspective. Yes, I do. It's in Time magazine. Sure, buddy. So to you, it's the overpopulation of ballots. To others, it's machine. To most, Trump lost because he lost. Trump got the wrong information. It was done with ballots. Okay, Papa Hotep. Now I gotta call you out on that. Listen, if Trump is gonna get up on stage and say something, then he's got to know that it's true. Because if it's a lie and he just gets up on stage and repeats it, that's on him. You can't. Oh yeah, he got the wrong. No. He has a responsibility. He's a grown ass man. Dude is 70-something years old, and he has the ability to say, okay, wait, do we have actual evidence of it? He has the ability. If he chooses not to exercise that ability, that's on him. That means he can't be trusted. That means if something serves him, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It doesn't matter if there's evidence or not. He's just going to run with it because he can possibly benefit on it. That's on him. That says what kind of individual Donald Trump is. What's the end game? Making sure Trump can't run for any office. Okay, so now here's what I think the game is. The game is to embarrass Trump. The game is to embarrass Trump to such a degree that he can't win an office. He can run, but he can't win. So their end game is to just make him look like a clown. Because basically that's what they're doing. They're showing that even his inner circle doesn't respect him. That's why they're showing all of this footage, because they want to show that the people closest to him, like show Ivanka. Like Ivanka isn't even on the same page as him. They're undermining his credibility. And quite frankly, he did it to himself. He did it to himself because he was running with something that he didn't have the evidence for. And the people that's closest to him are telling him this doesn't add up. So now let's say he still believes that the election was stolen. Then he needs to shut the hell up until he can actually prove it. Because if the people closest to him don't believe it, then there's nothing to talk about it. Because now he's just going to look like a fool, alienate the people closest to him, and with making these claims. And then, as we see, he made claim about the Minion machines, and now people are like, oh, that wasn't right information. So he just making stuff up. But this severely damages him and his viability. So while he may be legally able to run, they made him look like a complete clown. Correction, they've exposed the information. They've exposed the stuff that he was doing that demonstrated he's a clown. Because he was doing some clown stuff. He was doing making a lot of clown moves. Point blank, period. Okay, there's the link. I'll check it out. Trump lost. Yeah, that's why I think that. And I think COVID beat him. I think he had a shot and he came close. But the damage from COVID, I'm just saying I'm not a Trump nut. Everybody go to the link and read it for yourself. So Time wrote a piece detailing how Trump was cheated. Okay, but yeah, so I'll check out that article, that Time article you're talking about, and I'm gonna keep trying to see if I can see if I can find 2,000 Mules and check it out for myself. But like I said, Papa Hotep and anybody you know that believes that the election was stolen, tell them to check out today's testimony, because today's hearing was all about whether or not the election was stolen. That's what it was all about. It wasn't even about, and there's that little clip at the end that the chairman put on about the riot. Everything else today was about the election being stolen. Was the election stolen? Obviously, they're going to say it's not, but this is the evidence they're putting forward. So if you believe that the election was stolen, this is the evidence you've got to contrast and counter. Thank you, everybody, for checking out today's stream. Do you really think Biden got more votes than Obama? So if you've seen at the beginning, I talked about the mail-in ballots. And I said the mail-in ballots is how they got this guy to get the highest vote totals ever. Because they could basically convince people, listen, we know you don't feel like getting up off of your couch, going out into the weather, dealing with the elements, standing online for hours. So sit down, we'll bring the ballot to you. The mail-in ballots is what changed, is why the numbers were so high. That's why the mail-in ballots. Like that's what it was. Because now people didn't even need to get up out of their living rooms, off of their couches. They could just fill it out, put it in their mailbox, boom, be done with it. They didn't have to stand outside online. They didn't have to wait for hours. They didn't have to go out into the weather. They didn't have to go there because a lot of people just weren't motivated enough. But if all they have to do is fill out the ballot and then put it in the mailbox, okay, they'll do that. That's why the vote total was the highest ever. Thank you, everyone, for checking out today's stream. I will see you next time. Have a great day, people. Rest of your afternoon, rest of your day. Yeah.